Hello everyone, welcome back to the class, both to new and long-time students and lovers of history. This is History with Sire here today to discuss with you further about our US civil rights topic. If you haven't already, do check out the previous videos in this series. We've gone up right all the way up to here now to just after the Second World War. With that said, do remember as well, these are lessons catered towards the student level, concerning key knowledge on the topic, but also some historical skills will be practiced along the way. With that said, notepads and pens at the ready, and let us begin. So we finished our last lesson where we got to the end of the Second World War and we saw some clear progress had been made for the African Americans during the conflict. Particularly now this living memory of once again we have a generation of American people who fought side by side with each other, the African Americans and the white communities having to have each other's backs and support. But indeed there was challenge from it, and many people once again in the southern states still very much resist the idea once they return from the war and return home to the southern states. So in this video, we're going to look at how the African American community continue their battle for the civil rights cause and how they try and advance progress and actually come to form a real strong coalition and give birth to something that will be called the civil rights movement. What is this? What's it all about? Well, let us get into it. So it's important to remember a key thing we learned in our previous lesson that some clear advancement in civil rights had indeed occurred. For instance, we had a clear, massive success with Philip Randolph's March on Washington in 1941. This was a big success against the Roosevelt government, and he successfully managed to campaign using direct action and get Roosevelt to pass the Executive Order 8802, which managed to create the Fair Employment Practice Committee, or the FEPC. And this was a big goal for the African American community to hit, to remove that racial segregation and show actually that civil rights activists were preparing to take a more confrontational and active approach against the injustice of segregation in America. As said, the way Philip Randolph achieved this was through direct action. What is direct action? It is where the African Americans forcefully challenge segregation by deliberately flouting the Jim Crow laws. So in the case of the FEPC, they actually would do their march and they would protest the segregationist rules to prove to the American people that it was a flawed state and it was a big, big problem. And this method of direct action evolves during the Second World War and afterwards into something the African American community begin to use and rely upon. During the war in 1942, we also had the Congress for Racial Equality form, nicknamed CORE. And now CORE were a very important group because they actually came to the fore with their very famous journey of reconciliation in 1947. They were challenging the Supreme Court decision of Morgan v. Virginia that it came out. How did they do this? Well, what they did was they conducted sit-ins in the segregated restaurants of Chicago. When we say sit-ins, what this is a form of direct action where the protesters from CORE, they sat in the quote-unquote wrong seats in restaurants and refused to move from them. When we say the wrong seats, this is because they were segregated. So, of course, the white community in a restaurant would sit on one side of the restaurant, typically the nicer one with the better food, the better chairs, the better music. The African Americans will be made to sit on the lesser quality ones with worse conditions, maybe worse service, worse chairs, that kind of thing. And so what CORE were doing was they were going and sitting in the designated white areas, and this meant that the establishment would lose custom. That many of the racist whites would come in, refuse to sit where the African Americans were sitting in quote unquote their seats, and therefore they would call police in, and therefore they would cause all this kind of ruckus for them to be moved and taken out. The idea of this was, of course, to point out the impact, to pressure the system by being willing to suffer the consequences of sitting where they were so-called not allowed to sit, and therefore cause this disruption. This, as I say, had expanded massively because of Morgan v. Virginia. Morgan v. Virginia had passed in 1946. It ruled that segregation on interstate transport was not to be followed, that it was illegal, because of course you had these northern states who were looser in their beliefs in segregation versus the southern states who were very much entrenched with that belief and very much for it. And so by these CORE activists moving through the southern states, and also it's worth noting there were white activists journeying with them as well, very much supporting the cause. They were transporting on these interstate buses through the southern states. Many would be arrested, many would be thrown into jail, and of course prosecuted by the racist southern judges. And by doing this, it proved that actually segregation was being made to happen on interstate travel, and therefore Morgan v. Virginia was not being upheld. And so it really pointed out a massive flaw that was happening in the American system, where the Supreme Court's laws were not being adhered to. This all goes back to the NAACP. We should remember them when they first formed and became a big presence way back in the 1910s and 1920s. NAACP, the National Advancement Association of Colored People, this group were really pushing against the idea of Plessy v. Ferguson, this idea of separate but equal, that the facilities were so-called equal, but they weren't, and therefore they could prove that it was unconstitutional. And by the NAACP working through the law courts to prove these facilities were not indeed equal, they actually secured some very important victories. One of them was Henderson v. United States, where they managed to pass a law where segregation on railroad dining cars was indeed illegal. They had another one, McLaurin v. Oklahoma State Regents, where black students could not be physically separated from white students in the University of Oklahoma. And they had a third big victory with Sweat versus Painter, where a separate black Texan law school was not equal to the all-white University of Texas Law School, and therefore they had to admit the African Americans into the community instead. Because of this, this actually meant that Plessy v. Ferguson was essentially being overturned, and this would become a completed process with another key ruling known as Brown versus Topeka, which we'll get onto in our following lesson. And it's very important to understand all of this is happening in the 1940s, just after the Second World War. We've now reached 1950, and there's some clear de jure lawful advancement in the cases for civil rights. And it's important to understand the media is beginning to play a big role in this. The newspapers, the radios, and this new wonderful thing called television is becoming quite popular. Americans are going to have the money, have the ability to buy these devices, and therefore tap into the news and gain a more widespread opinion on it. America is going to become a much more connected nation, and no longer can the southern racism in the South be free from federal management as time goes on. And we also have to understand direct action has really become very important, and it's seen and proving that peaceful protest is a way forward. And for the sake of our debate, it's increasing the pace of change. You may remember from our 1917 to 1941 Assessing the Change video that we concluded that change was quite slow, quite limited, and it was becoming relatively easy for the federal government to ignore issues and not really do much about them. But because of direct action coupled with the greater and rising presence through the media, actually we're going to actually see a big acceleration in civil rights advancements being made. We've already seen quite a few in just 10-year time gap since 1941 going up to 1950. We're going to see an even bigger increase in this as time goes on. So what exactly is the response from the federal government at this time? Well, a quick reminder is that towards the end of the Second World War in early 1945, Roosevelt did indeed die while in office, and his successor, Harry Truman, the vice president, took his place. Now, Truman, it's worth noting, Truman actually hails from Missouri, which had some tendencies towards the Southern segregationist ways. It's also worth noting as well there were, of course, some KKK links as well within this state of America. But for Truman's sake, he understood that the federal government had really done little to advance the African American rights since that Civil War era. Now, Truman, also because he came from Missouri, had some racist tendencies himself. He of course, grew up in a relatively racist environment, and therefore he was racist not only to African American but also to others as well, like Mexicans and Chinese immigrants. However, by the 1930s, Truman was beginning to change, and he actually supported legislation against the poll tax and lynching in the 1930s. Now he was president, he was actually going to do actions to help the African Americans by pressuring Congress and also using executive orders. One of his more famous actions was to set up the President's Committee on Civil Rights. This was done in 1946, just after the Second World War, because he wanted to investigate attacks that were happening on black servicemen. You may remember me talking about those, how the African Americans who came home and were proudly wearing their uniforms and medals, especially in the southern states, were suffering racial abuse and physical assault. This committee then passed a very liberal report for the time, which was dubbed Secure These Rights. It was officially published in 1949. This was a big leap for political progress at the time. It called up the United States to live up to its claim to lead the free world by treating black Americans as equals. You may remember that Double V campaign. This was the idea to achieve not only equality abroad, but now to focus and achieve equality at home as well. And there was a lot that was included in it for the federal government to use its powers to achieve, especially the abolishment of the poll tax, the anti lynching legislation, to improve voting right laws, especially for the southern states, to ensure the Fair Employment Practice Committee would remain permanent, to also end discrimination on interstate travel, to end discrimination in the armed forces, and a whole host of other things that it was building upon, especially to improve those civil rights. We dare to say that these are revolutionary recommendations that Truman was really going to push for, and to his credit, he was indeed working his way to achieving this. For instance, he passed the Executive Order 9981 in July 1948, which was an order to abolish discrimination and segregation within the armed forces. There was indeed some resistance to this, it sadly has to be said, but when we reach a conflict called the Korean War, they were forced to implement Truman's orders during the conflict. He also passed another executive order, 10308, which created the Committee on Government Contract Compliance, or CGCC for short, which put pressure on other companies with federal contracts to end their own discrimination as well. However, there was a big impact that this had on the Democrat Party. You may remember me saying how the Democrats were very much rooted in the segregationist states of the South. That's where a lot of their support base have been, not just here in recent years, but way back since before the Civil War era as well. So about 100 years, they relied on these southern states to support them. And sure enough, this resistance that was coming from the party hailed strongly in these southern states. Now, I've talked a lot about the gentleman on the left here, Truman, but this other gentleman on the right became very influential as well. Who is he? He's Storm Thurmond. Thurmond was a strong supporter of the solid South the Democrats really relied on. And remember, this solid South was very much against the Reconstruction era that the Republicans had wanted to do in the 1860s and 1870s. Now they could see the Democrat Party was taking this very liberal stance on civil rights. Like Storm Thurmond and many others saw it as a betrayal of what the Democrat Party was rooted in and for. And so he actually formed a splinter group of these Southern Democrats, which were called Dixiecrats, and they formally left the party ready for the presidential election of 1948, and they actually ran with Storm Thurmond as their candidate instead. This really caused a big fracturing problem for Truman, and many thought he was actually going to lose the 1948 election, especially because a lot of the support for the Democrats had been rooted in Roosevelt's image as president since way back in the early 1930s and not Truman. There actually was even publications in the newspaper ahead of time, and the Republicans under Thomas Dewey would win the election and not Truman. They would be proved wrong, though, and Truman did indeed win that majority, but it was a much smaller majority than what Roosevelt had been winning comfortably with for the past four presidential terms. All in all, though, there was a clear impact that this civil rights movement was going to have on the Democrat Party, and this is where, for the sake of our debate, we're seeing a real shift what the political parties really focus on in regards to civil rights. As we see this increase in federal intervention on the states' rights level, we're also seeing a transformation of party politics as well. So the two indeed do connect quite strongly. Where will things go from here? What's going to happen as we enter the 1950s? Has Truman done enough, or should civil rights keep expanding? And will direct action actually keep working? Well, that's what we're going to find out in our following lesson. Do make sure you're subscribed. Do make sure you are commenting below. Your interaction is what makes this series. I do hope you are finding it quite useful along the way. With all that said, I will see you in our following lesson. I hope you found this insightful, found it useful. This has been History with Sire. Thank you for listening.